What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making a Sci-Fi POS terminal. Now this week's video is basically just going to be a time-lapse speed modeling video, so I won't be talking throughout the whole process like I usually do. However, I will be jumping in here and there just to explain a few of the small things I'm doing. So let's just get started. Alright, so to get started we're going to select the cube and start blocking out those main shapes. Now I'm just going to start off with the side, and then once I'm happy with it, I can duplicate it over to create the other side of this object. So just like every other video, we are going to start with blocking everything out, and then we can start refining all of those shapes afterwards. So when it came to reference, I used a few different photos and drawings that I came across on Google Images and on Pinterest. And there's one drawing in particular that I really based this model off of. Now this drawing was created from an artist named YKKZ. And I saw this image on Pinterest, and luckily there was an ARTSTATION link, so I will link that in the description below. But this artist did a really great job, and I wanted to take a lot of these ideas and incorporate them into my 3D model. Now it was only showing a front angle view, so I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do for the bottom and for all the other sides, so I just looked on Google Images and I looked up random sci-fi objects, and I just took a lot of inspiration and I decided to mix random things into this model and more or less just figure it out along the way. So you'll see throughout the video I experiment with a few different shapes as I'm trying to figure out exactly what I want to do and what I want to add into this model. I also wanted to quickly mention that if you're interested in seeing this video in more of a real-time speed, I will be uploading this video to my Patreon page, which will also include the full UV mapping process. Now we will be going over the UV mapping in this video, but since we just do the exact same thing over and over again, I just decided to cut some of that portion out just to save time on this video. And I am also going to be uploading the FBX file for this model, along with the Substance Painter working files, just so you can see exactly how I'm doing everything, and hopefully it can make it easier for everyone learning how to use this software. Alright, enough of me talking, let's just move on with the video. you Alright, so that's basically everything for the 3D modeling. Now we just need to start doing some of those UVs. Alright, so I'm going to start off with that side object, the first object that we created in our scene. Now before anything, I'm just going to zoom in and start cleaning up some of this topology. As you can see, this object is relatively low in polys right now, and I will want to smooth it out just so I can have some smoother edges and curves on this shape. Now this isn't completely necessary depending on how your object's going to be used. However, in this case, I want to have some smoother curves, especially on the edge of this object. So let's just clean it up a little bit. So after I'm done cleaning up some of this topology and attaching some of those vertices, I can then go up to mesh and then smooth out this object. Now after smoothing out my object, as you can see, it's going to add a lot of polys to this shape. Now you could just go ahead with this, however in this case I do want to clean it up a little bit. A lot of those polys that this smooth tool creates are unnecessary, and I don't need those unnecessary polys in my scene. So after I smooth out my object, I'm going to go ahead and start cleaning up by removing some of those unnecessary edges, and then using that target well tool and the multi-cut tool, I can start attaching other vertices wherever I need them. So let's go ahead and clean up this object a little bit, and then using our 3D cut and sew UV tool, we can start creating our own cuts and lay them out in our UV editor. Alright, so as you can see, now the object is much lower in polys after we use that smooth tool, but it's still nice and smooth and curved around those edges, just like how I want the object to be. So next up is just creating those UV cuts so we can lay them out in our UV editor. So I'm going to do this with the 3D cut and sew UV tool. Now just before we do that, we need to remove all of the cuts on this object. So I'm going to go up to UV and I'm going to do a camera-based projection to remove all of those cuts. And then like I said, using that 3D cut and sew UV tool, I can right click, go up to component and edge, and then double click on whichever edge I want to create that cut. Once I'm happy with those cuts, I can go Control U to unfold and Control L to lay them out in my UV editor. Now I just want to make sure they're nice and straight, so I'm going to rotate those shells, and I'm just going to basically repeat the same process for all the other shapes in my scene. Alright, so next shape in our scene is going to be our small little gray button on the bottom. So as you can see, this shape doesn't need to be smoothed out anymore. Everything is nice and smooth and looking good. So we can start off with doing a UV camera-based projection. That way we can remove all of the cuts on the object. And then just like we did before, using our 3D cut and sew UV tool, we can right click, go to component to edge, and double click on whichever edges we would like to make those cuts. And once we're happy with all of our cuts, we can select all of those UV shells, go Control U to unfold, and then Control L to lay them out. And it's always good to straighten those shells whenever you can. It can really save you a lot of room in your UV map. And it's also good to straighten those UVs whenever you have the proper shells to do that. And that little tool is under the Unfold tab that's in your UV toolkit. You see I do that on a lot of my UV shells that are just nice and straight, and you don't have to worry about any of the curves. Alright, so let's just continue on and UV a few other objects together. So next up is the other small little gray button, and luckily for us we just have to UV one of them, and then we can duplicate that same shape to create all the other buttons in our scene. Now I didn't realize this, but I did UV this object ahead of time, so I'm just going to do the same thing by doing camera-based projection and doing those cuts along those corners, and then I can unfold it to make sure that the top face is nice and flat. That way I can project those numbers directly onto this mesh. Now, like I said, I already did this, so I'm just going to Control Z all of this since I already have that UV shell complete. And then we can select all those buttons and just move them off to the side. Later on, we're just going to move those shells around and organize them properly. All right, so I'm just going to let this video play out a tiny bit more. We can do a few other shapes together. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you're interested in seeing the whole UV mapping process, this will be in the video that I will upload to my Patreon page. And you can find that in the description below. All right, so let's just continue UVing a few other objects. Alright, so here's the object in its finished form. Now what I decided to do is just add one texture map. Since there's so few objects in the scene, I thought only one texture would make most sense for this object. Now I did not combine all these shapes, and I wanted to make a note that if you were to export this for a video game or something like that, you should probably combine all these objects. But since I am uploading this FBX to my Patreon page, I thought I should just leave them in their own separate groups. That way you can see how I went about and organized this model, and hopefully this will make it easier for people to learn and understand this model. Now let me open up that UV editor and I'll show you how I did those UVs. So I went ahead and, like I mentioned, just combined everything into one map. Now I made sure to straighten all of the shells that were nice and straight, like these pieces of paper and the screen. That way when I add my text later on in Photoshop, I know it's going to be nice and straight and I don't have to worry about any weird warping or any of the fonts looking strange, not straight. So if I highlight all of these objects and I turn on that grid pattern, you'll see that everything's looking nice and straight and I'm not having any weird warps or anything in this checkered pattern. So all I did was just add one texture to all of these objects, and then I can export it into Substance Painter so we can start texturing. Really quickly, before we jump into Substance Painter, I just want to explain something that happened throughout this whole video process. So usually I use my main monitor, the one directly in front of me, for most of my software. So Maya and all my texturing, I do that on my main monitor. Now Substance Painter, for some reason, it's always been like this. It just pops up on my monitor to my left. So I just changed the recording software to record my other monitor when I jump into the texturing process. Now I've been doing this for over a year now, so you think I would know to change it, but for some reason I just forgot and I kept recording my other monitor. So at the end of this texturing process, when I jumped into the video editing software to just edit all of these clips, I realized I didn't capture anything of the real texturing process, and I just recorded the background image on my other display for about an hour. And I just wasted all of that recording time. Now, obviously I want to show you the whole texturing process, so I quickly jumped back into Substance and retextured it, recording the proper monitor, and I just redid all of my steps. So if you notice any small differences between those final renders and this whole texturing process, that is the reason why. It's just because I had to do it twice, and I just changed and shortened a few things up just so I can speed up the process so I didn't have to redo every little detail. Alright, so enough of me explaining the story, let's jump into Substance and we can start texturing. Alright, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go load in our FBX file from Maya. And if everything's looking good, you can go to your texture set settings and go bake out your textures. Now the texture set settings does look a little bit different than usual, and that's just because of the most recent Substance Painter update, but everything is basically the same, so you can just follow the same steps and bake out those textures. Now, like I mentioned before, this is basically just going to be a speed modeling time-lapse video, so I won't be explaining the full process, but I basically just use all of those built-in materials that Substance Painter comes with, and I just adjust those settings and tweak those materials to change how they look. Now, one important note is I do change the shader settings to alpha blending, and that is just so I can add an emissive as well as an opacity channel to my materials. That way I can add that transparency to that glass and screen material, as well as the emissive glowing effect to those lights on my object. Other than that, everything is the same as usual. Alright, so let's just start filling all of these empty meshes with materials, and then we can start tweaking and refining things afterwards. Alright, so that's basically everything. That is the whole 3D modeling, UV mapping, and texturing process that I did to create this Sci-Fi POS terminal. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I did forget to record the whole texturing process, so the final renders are slightly different than this current model that we textured. And that's just because I spent more time on the original textures, just adding those tiny details, but other than that, everything is basically the exact same. Now, if you're interested in seeing this whole video in more of a real-time pace, as well as seeing the whole UV mapping process, this video will be uploaded to my Patreon page, as well as the FBX file along with the Substance Painter working files. So for all of you out there that are learning Maya and Substance Painter, hopefully having access to these files will make your whole learning process a little bit easier. Alright, thanks so much for tuning into this week's video. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to see more weekly 3D content. Alright, I'll catch you guys in the next one.